This is the best group that I speak to because it's always so joyful and everyone is so welcoming. It just feels very nice to be. I feel like I'm coming home again. So I will begin. As a lady does not usually like to say her age, I'll just say that I was born in 1728. I figured out to keep us busy trying to add it up. Born in London, and my parents were not happy with London, not so much the king or anything like that, and they came to Georgia. The good ship Anne, as they call it, it's like one word, the good ship Anne, came over in 1733. But my parents decided that they would move in 36. I have been baptized in the Anglican Church. In fact, most of my family and uncles, aunts, whatever, they were also baptized in the Anglican Church, which was very strong at that time. And that was something that kind of kept my family back a little bit because they were afraid that the original settlers over here were mostly Methodists, and they were a little afraid of that. In fact, the talk around London was, if you were a Methodist, that meant you had a method for everything that you did. So they were backed off just a little, but not enough to keep them. I was 8 years old when we came over, and it was 3 years after the good ship Anne, and it was amazing. As we pulled into Savannah Harbor, you just could not believe the purity of the air, and there were birds around. We came aboard. They had already started. They were building homes, and that had only been 3 years' time. They already had the main thoroughfare that would go down. It was named for Bull, Colonel Bull, and they had little squares, and then there would be a street going down, and then another square, and it was really quite lovely. The trees, and I guess, as my father said, the flora and fauna was just something that he had never seen. There were a lot of mulberry trees, and even at my young age, I was just fascinated with the mulberry trees because they smelled so good. They were in bloom when I got there. So it was very interesting to see, and when I found out why there were so many mulberry trees around Savannah, it was quite interesting. That was the first agricultural business in Georgia, was silk. And the mulberry trees had to feed the silkworms. And that lasted for about 20 years. I know that I was in my late teens, and when it finally fell apart, so to speak, because obviously the Orient was more versed in that. Yamacraw Bluff was also a great place that my siblings and I liked to go, and that was where Colonel Bull and Oglethorpe had first landed, and it was named Yamacraw Bluff for the Indians. They were an offshoot of the Creeks, the lower Creeks, which actually was the upper Creeks. But they really enjoyed, they had their own little settlements there and everything, and I didn't ever get to meet Mary Musgrove. She was very instrumental in getting things going. She was a half-breed, and she was very good at speaking her language and speaking the English language. She ended up with like 6 husbands, so I think she kind of spread herself around a little bit. She had a Scottish one, she had an Indian one, and she just kind of, they seemed to die on her for some reason. She was busy. The trustees' garden was a very nice place. They had a lot of trees, shrubs, vegetable plants, so when you first came over, you could go and get them. You didn't have to pay for them, so that you could start yourself off immediately. Georgia was just a great place. It was like the Garden of Eden for those of us that were coming out of the areas in London. James Habersham. I was 16, he was 32. Oh, yes, that's what I usually get when I say that. But in my time, that was acceptable, that he would certainly take care of a 16-year-old. But the caveat was that I had to become a Methodist because he had converted from Anglican to Methodist. He was very enamored of Wesley, and he very much wanted to follow that and the precepts. He wanted to help people, and that was basically the beginning of what he felt was Methodism, to be in the community to help. And I kind of get that while I'm listening to the various things that this group does. With trepidation, I said, okay, because a woman should follow her husband. And so we were married, and it was kind of difficult. I was 16, as I said, and he had begun to really become an entrepreneur. He was the first person to have, I remember the mulberry trees for the slave, gave a lot of money to it and had it grow as he went along. He also was a businessman, and he saw that Georgia needed to have a ban on slavery. South Carolina had slavery, and they were prospering. Georgia was not. I kept thinking, perhaps we can keep the ban on slavery and have people work and make for their own money and things, rather than have someone else. Because I certainly saw in the future what was going to happen. He bought much land around, and he wanted a rice plantation. He eventually did. It was 15,000 acres, and he owned 200 slaves. But as he was gone all the time, who do you think this fell upon to take care of? This is very difficult. I always said that my children knew when I was coming because I made such a clanking sound, because everything had to be locked up. So I had this great big keychain around, and when I was out of the plantation, we locked up the salt, we locked up the butter, we locked up the cows, we locked up everything. And it just became overwhelming. So I was probably not always gracious when he came back from London. Number one, I didn't want to do it anymore, but I didn't want to relinquish the control that I had either. My sons were born here in Georgia. My husband and I were not. He had spent more time in Georgia than he had spent in London or England. And it was very difficult. I began to notice that the boys were sneaking out at night. Wasn't sure what they were doing, but found out that they were spending an awful lot of time in Tondi's Tavern. Well, that did not sit very well with me, and I certainly didn't tell my husband because I was hearing rumblings about what they were doing. And I finally found out that they were Sons of Liberty, and they were very strong in that. So they weren't at the tavern for tavern's sake. So that kind of made me feel a little bit better, but I wasn't too sure about that. They started this committees of correspondence, and they would correspond with someone up in Boston, for something. They would write down what was going on over there and what they were doing. And then that letter would come down to Philadelphia, and someone in Philadelphia would add a little something to it. Then it would come down to Charleston. And that was the only way that they had to notify one another what was going on. And of course, when the blockade of Boston came and the Boston Massacre, that really put fuel to the fire. And there was constant fighting between my husband and my sons, and I was in the middle wondering, whatever side wins, it's not going to be a win for anyone. But everyone in Philadelphia said, do not go. When we finally find a passage, we will be able to send him to London, but you shouldn't go with him because we don't know whether you'll get back or if you would get back. So as I still had children, I turned around and went back to Savannah. Coming back to Savannah was very, very difficult. In those years, when a woman no longer had a husband, she was a non-entity. When I got back, I found out that my favorite house, I called it the Pink House in Savannah, was no longer mine. My son and daughter-in-law were living there. She had allowed me 4 everyday dresses, and all of my jewelry and accoutrements, everything, were taken by my daughters-in-law. I no longer owned anything. I wasn't invited anywhere. I was a widow, and that was it. My life had ceased as far as anyone was concerned. Having had the ability to run the plantations and take care of everything, do all the business, this was really a come down. I had 2 rooms in the attic of my home. Ladies, put yourself in the situation. How would you feel with that? The sons took over all the businesses, and I really had nothing to do. My former friends who were still married had nothing to do with me because I was no longer a part of the community. Joseph was the most successful. He sat on the Council of Safety. He was a colonel in the 1st Georgia Regiment, which fought so bravely in the recent time. But he had to resign because he had served as Lachlan McIntosh's second in the duel with Button Gwinnett. You probably remember Button Gwinnett, who was the signer of the Declaration of Independence from here. And by the way, even in your day, Button Gwinnett's autograph is worth more than just about anyone's on the market because he didn't sign many things. He was very uneducated, and the few things that he signed are worth something today. Black for the widows. I guess so they could point her out on the street or something like that. I've never really figured that out. The only underpinning we have was a chemise. Ladies, I want you to listen to this very closely. It was a one-piece outfit, and it had an opening in the back for necessary things. It also was very low cut so that you could nurse continuously. So those were some of the things that were just a little bit different for the ladies of the time. And I can't say that they were comfortable at all. The siege of Savannah was absolutely frightening. As I said, I was in the attic, and I could hear and see. They bombarded the city of Savannah for so long. The only food that we could get that wasn't grown maybe in our backyard was trucked down through the swamp. I should say trucked down. What came through the swamps from Beaufort, South Carolina. They were very, very good to us and helped in every way that they could. Other holdings that we have, the plantation, and that was just burned completely. But what surprised me the most is that the slaves stayed there. And as I looked at them, I thought, they're in the same fix I am. We have no place else to go. Where were they going to go? Where was I going to go? Back to my attic room. It was not a good time. The males were euphoric because they were getting rights that they'd never had before. They were able to do anything that they were able to do, but women still were not allowed many of these things. And this was difficult. Joseph was the 3rd Postmaster General of the United States, and he was appointed by George Washington. And as luck would have it, they decided to move to Washington City. Now, did they tell me they were going to Washington City? They just left. And in some of my writings, I did not speak kindly of them, let's put it that way. But I have the whole house to myself now. I became the housekeeper, and I stopped wearing widow's garb, which was just absolutely unheard of in those days. I thought that I would do some entertaining. First couple of times that I had a party, not one soul came. But I thought when they found out what kind of food that I served, perhaps they would come to the 3rd party, which they did. At one point, in 1791, Washington had a visit. And as I was no longer married, I can say this. He was a fine figure of a man. Quite enjoyable to look upon. And he came to my home and has supped with me. He was about 6 feet tall, weighed approximately 200 pounds, and he came to the town to present 2 cannon that were in Yorktown, or were captured at Yorktown, and he presented them to the Chatham Artillery. So when he came, he said, we will give these to the city of Savannah and to the Chatham Artillery. And one of the finest things he said was coming here was being able to sample the Chatham Artillery punch. I don't know how many of you have had a chance to savor that, but if you ever get down to Savannah and visit me, you will certainly get a Chatham Artillery punch. You probably will not be able to drive back home after that, but you will enjoy it.